Hello, everybody. Just going to give people a couple minutes to flow in here, and then we'll get started. Just another minute or so. Still got some people coming in. All right, we can kind of get it started here. So first of all, wanted to thank you all for joining us here at Lumifi for our SOC quarterly threat brief. This is covering Q2 of this year. If you're looking for information on CrowdStrike, that might be something we cover in Q3, since it technically happened in Q3, but obviously it's the talk of the town right now. So we'll get there. I'm sure it'll be a big topic in our next one, but we're going to kind of stick to Q2 here for this one. Wanted to give brief introductions. My name is Jordan Weiner. I'm the manager of the cyber threat intelligence team here at Lumifi. Been with the company for about 4.5 years. Enjoyed every second of it. And I've got Anthony here who's on my team as well. Let him give a quick introduction.
Hey everybody, Anthony Red Hat August Radzikavich here. I'm an offensive threat detection engineer, so I get the wonderful opportunity of looking into the things that we're going to be talking about today and creating detections and doing threat hunts and all sorts of fun stuff. So really enjoy it and very happy to be here to share it with you.
Awesome. Thank you, Anthony. All right, we'll go on to the next slide. All right, so some of the objectives for this webinar today. We're going to go over pretty briefly some of the critical CVEs that we identified, kind of high level what the CVEs are, the software that's impacted, and mitigation recommendations, which for the most part is really going to be centered around making sure that you have updated software. Then we'll kind of pivot to more of the bigger type security incidents /news. So three of the things that we'll be covering will be the Palo Alto PANOS. This is one of the CVEs that we will briefly cover. Progress is MOVEit and the Blacksuit Ransomware Group. And then we will kind of wrap it all up with some of the new detections that my team has developed in this quarter. And then, of course, we'll end with some Q&A. So let's get it rolling. All right, so first CVE here, prominent CVEs as we call them. So these are going to be associated with VMware and specifically vCenter Server. So you kind of see in that first bar there, the two CVEs that we're talking about, 3079, 37080. So these are, again, specifically associated with the vCenter Server, essentially outlining a heap overflow that can result in remote code execution for malicious actors. And typically with remote code execution based vulnerabilities, you will see a higher CVSS score just because of what remote code execution can result in. But something that I did want to outline is though this has a CVSS score of 9.8, there has not been any POCs released for this specific vulnerability, and it has not actually been identified as being exploited in the wild or included in CISA's known exploited vulnerability list. So all three of those things can kind of rapidly increase the severity of a vulnerability if it's actively being exploited. This, of course, is going to change how it's being viewed in the security space. And due to the limited information about how this vulnerability actually goes about being executed, and there's no POC that's been released up to this point, that can make it difficult to build detections. But again, the risk surface here is a bit lower because it has not actually been observed exploited in the wild. So from a mitigation perspective for both these CVEs, it's just updating to the most recent versions of vCenter. So kind of moving on here for Palo Alto Networks, this was a huge one that I'm sure many of you on the call were affected by back in May. Again, we actually are going to dive into this a bit more coming up soon. So I won't get into the details too much, but at a high level, essentially permitting unauthenticated attackers to execute arbitrary code with root privileges on the firewall. And so the effect of this was pretty severe, and scanning for this vulnerability was very widespread. This was something that was being exploited in the wild. It was included in CISA's known exploited vulnerability list, which is why the severity of something like this was kind of top notch, right? This was the talking point, kind of like CrowdStrike is right now. You know, a couple months ago, what happened here with Palo Alto was one of those instances as well. So we'll actually dive into this a bit more coming up with Anthony. All right, and kind of wrapping up the CVEs here. We do have this one CVE for GitHub. Obviously, GitHub is a pretty prominently utilized repository. And this specific vulnerability allows attackers to forge a SAML response to gain access to a user with administrative privileges. So obviously, with that capability, if you are able to, gain access to a privileged account, this can lead to pretty severe consequences, such as access to code repositories, potential loss of source code, and breaches of information. So mitigation, upgrading to a version of GitHub Enterprise Server that is not affected by the CVE. That's kind of the typical route here, as you've seen with all of them that we've identified so far. Thankfully, they have been patched, so that's always a good thing to see. And the last one here for MOVEit. Again, this is something that we'll be diving into a bit more here in a second. But I just kind of wanted to preface with why we kind of, at this point in time, look at vulnerabilities associated with MOVEit at such a high criticality rate, because if you'll remember last year, there was a 0-day vulnerability associated with MOVEit that had pretty severe impact for a lot of organizations. So though this specific vulnerability was not at that same criticality, when we identify solutions that have had issues such as 0 days previously, we have to ensure that we stay up with what is occurring with that application and product moving forward. Alrighty, and I will pass it off to Anthony here to talk more about the Palo Alto PANOS vulnerability.
All right, thank you, Jordan. So as Jordan said, we're first going to start off with the PANOS vulnerability and the exploit that came out with it, what the impact of that was, starting with the timeline, then looking at the exploit itself, and then we'll have the calls to action that Jordan will take over for that. So for this, the timeline of this is on April 11th. It was disclosed, and Palo Alto began doing the patches on the 14th. Now, by the 16th, we already had POC code, right? So we're talking, got disclosed 5 days later, we have code that we can exploit this. However, Palo Alto in another 2 days was able to conclude the patches, and those patches will be listed in a future slide. So we're talking a week, right? Disclosed, week to full-on fixes here. Next slide, please. All right, so the CVE specifically that we're talking about is 2024-3400, or 30, yeah, you get it, 3400. What this is it's a command injection using the SES-ID cookie, but it also contains a directory traversal, which we're going to see in this next slide. There are 2 different functionalities out of the proof of concept code that was released. I put the GitHub link for you to analyze that code if you so wish at the bottom of this page. But one of the things is you can create a file on the system. So I'm presuming an empty file on the system that's owned by root. So we have arbitrary file creation. Now, effectively, this doesn't really do much, but if an attacker were to want to bloat a system or create a bunch of files on that system, they would have the capability of doing so. And sending this packet in maybe like a scriptified manner would be kind of trivial to get that done, right? So we could do this as some type of, denial of service by creating, or inode exhaustion, by creating arbitrary files. But more importantly, we have arbitrary code execution. So, you know, the attackers or we hackers really, really love our RCEs. In this case, you'll see that the data packet is hitting SSL VPN hipreport.esp, right? We send the web request to there, and we are leveraging the cookie of sysID, and that's where you see the directory traversal, the dot dot forward slash dot dot forward slash, and then it's going back, and you'll notice that we have here a curl with a variable for IFS. That's a Linux way to enter a white space within the command line without actually having a white space in there. So if you want a little hacker trick, that's one of the things that you can do. And then specifying, hey, what they're doing is they're reaching out. In this example, they're curling a website or a web page that they control. It has some code in it, and inside that code, they're able to call upon a parameter, it's a variable within that page, to execute the whoami command. So with this, it's fairly simple to craft packets like this, to craft web requests to get that arbitrary code execution. Now, through this process, one of the things that was said to mitigate this was, disable telemetry. That was the very first thing. This is the workaround. It's not the fix. This is the band-aid to the problem. Disable telemetry. And it turned out that unfortunately that did not resolve the problem. But again, remember, from the point of disclosure all the way to the finished fixes, we're talking a week's time. So I'll turn it back over to Jordan for those calls to action.
All right, thank you, Anthony. So again, as Anthony mentioned, they were able to release patching about a week later. So if you are utilizing PANOS, make sure it's updated to one of those following versions that we have outlined here. And additionally, something that Palo Alto did specifically identify, and Lumifi as an organization, we did send out an advisory to all of our customers when this occurred, essentially outlining that really, if you do suspect that you had been compromised in some way, the best way to actually investigate and identify if you had been compromised was to reach out to Palo Alto Networks for forensics that they would actually perform on the firewall itself. So that was something that we expressed to our customer base, and that is something still, if you think that you are affected by this, that would be the appropriate action for you to proceed with. So from a Lumifi perspective, when we became aware of this specific CVE, obviously our first goal is to understand it as best we can with the information that we have available. And right away, if we are able to identify any sort of IOCs, whether it be behavioral based, IOC based from an IP domain perspective, we begin, my team, the analyst team, we begin threat hunting across all of our customer environments. And especially when you're talking about an individual product like Palo Alto, if we find that, or we know that you guys have Palo Altos in your organization, there's going to be a targeted approach there to really try to understand the activity that's occurring. And this kind of beyond that initial identification, we're continually staying up to date with any other updates that come out to update our detections, expand upon our threat hunting, and provide additional information that may be pertinent to continuing to protect your organization from these types of vulnerabilities. All righty, moving on to MOVEit here. Take it away, Anthony.
All right, so next up in our line of analysis here is the progresses MOVEit Transfer and MOVEit Gateway. Again, same format, timeline. We'll look at what the exploit is, how that works, and then the calls to action. So this one, I kind of want to exemplify this because coming from an offensive background, right, we talk about responsible disclosure. And I really like this timeline because if we start at the very end, you'll notice that Watchtower Labs published the article, had proof of concept code, but that was all the way on the 25th. The CVE record was created on the 10th, which means that, in my opinion, Progress did a very good job in the responsible disclosure, got hot fixes the very next day after that CVE record was created, And then there was a period of time, 2 weeks, you'll notice, to say, hey, our customer base, please make sure you put these hot fixes in place. And then this was publicly disclosed by Watchtower Labs so that we could analyze what this traffic was looking like, what the attack looked like. So, in my opinion, very good job working together to fix the security before something was released. Anyway, let's move on to what that actually looks like. It's very, and I do encourage, if you have the time, go ahead and read their article. It's pretty in-depth on how it works, but there are 3 different methods in gaining access to that system, because this is a authentication bypass. That's what's happening, right? Now, the first way to get this done is if you're on the same network, when you're logging into the system, you can send what's called a UNC, a universal naming convention path. That's typically represented by the 2 backslashes and then a server name, right? So if we access a shared server on the network, that's what we're talking about. You can specify that in the login and then point it to your computer that's on the same network, okay? What's going to happen there is if you're using a utility like Responder and you're listening for that traffic, the way that Windows works is it's going to send the authentication hash to authenticate that process. And therefore, as an attacker, intercepting this connection essentially, or really I'm creating that connection myself, right? It's all controlled by the attacker. I can grab the net NTLM version 2 hash, and then I can crack that on the side. So I can do offline cracking for that. So that's the first method that could lead to the compromise of the authentication in this. However, it gets better, because the second method is to upload an SSH key. That SSH key can be in various formats. The whole point of this is that you need to upload this key somewhere on the server. Now, you have to keep in mind, what is this service? What is it about? It's a file transferring service. It can be a backup service, right? So that's its whole job, is to upload and download and do all these things with files. Arbitrarily, right, we can just upload to that. If we can get an SSH key in there, we no longer specify a UNC path, but instead we specify the path that's on that server, right? So on that MOVEit server. With this, again, it can be of any format. We point it to there, and any user, it has to be a valid user, right? Any user that we attempt to log in, we specify that path will be authenticated as that user. So long as we have a valid user list, and we can get those in a variety of different ways. We can get those through dumps, we can get those through dictionary attacks, brute forcing, social engineering, right? There's ways that we get that user list. But any user that I would like to be, if I were attacking the system, all I need to do is make sure I got that SSH key in there, specify that username, and I will have all of their rights on that system. Now, it gets arguably worse. We have to have the same exact requirement of having a valid user on the system, right? Lots of different ways to do that, as I said. However, I don't need any rights at all with method 3. And this is really tricky. And notice in method 3 here, we're going to do something called log poisoning. But because we're poisoning a log, we can no longer specify an SSH key of any format, right? You might have done RSA keys before, or maybe you're doing elliptical curve keys. These are pretty common when we're dealing with SSH. However, this one specifically has to be in a PPK format. The reason for this is when the authentication hits, it'll read the top line, typically saying, hey, we're going to begin the RSA key, right? And then it'll read the key, and then it closes it at the very end. Well, since it's in a log, there's a lot of information at the beginning. There's a lot of information underneath. And the way that those key structures work, it will not parse appropriately. However, using a PPK, which is a PuTTY format, we can inject it into the log through the login mechanism. So we literally just copy the key, put it into the login form and press enter, right? Then we know where that log is stored. So we, instead of providing the file path of an uploaded key that we controlled, we provide the path on the system to that log. And again, the same exact thing, we have a valid user, we point to that log in this format, and we have authentication with whatever user we have. And of course, we can take whatever actions that they have rights to. So really, really intriguing. Also, it is good for me to note that this wasn't just an exploit on Progress's MOVEit, Gateway, and Transfer products, but it was like a dual vulnerability issue, right? This was an issue with the library as well, and I'm drawing a blank on what that was, but it had to do with the SSH mechanisms in this functionality.
All righty, thank you for that, Anthony. So from a customer perspective, luckily this is a bit more simple in terms of, what you can do from a mitigation perspective is really just making sure that you're on one of the more updated versions, so that specific vulnerability is no longer at risk. And from the Lumifi perspective, as you can see with Anthony's, very detailed description of what's actually going on here, when we're able to retain the required information and really understand how these vulnerabilities are broken down from top to bottom, that's how we end up with these vulnerability specific detections like we've got outlined here. So Anthony outlined, 3 different methods, and out of that, we were able to deem, 4 unique detections. And this is really what we aim to achieve every time that, we perform research and we identify something new. This is always the goal, but there's not always the right information available to us to result in a high fidelity detection, which is always the absolute critical, most important thing. We want to provide coverage over identified threat, but we also want to make sure that it's highly reliable so that your team and our SOC analysts are not being flooded with just potential false positives, right? All right, and we're going to kind of wrap it up here with Blacksuit Ransomware Gang.
All right, so here it's a little bit different because we're not talking about exploits or vulnerabilities, we're talking about the exploiters, but still the same timeline and understanding this group, what their preferred targets are, and in case that's a worry to you, it probably should be, and an example of their tactics and techniques workflow and what they've done with an unidentified target specifically, right? So their exact actions. Now with that, the timeline, this group, it's like, who's Blacksuit? Why are they important? Who are they? Like, oh, it's new. If you remember back in early 2020, there's a big group that was out there big time called Conti. The Conti ransomware group, I could probably talk a lot longer about them, but they were pretty prolific. They were doing a lot of stuff. They were extremely busy and they were extremely effective. Now, in September of 22, they kind of disbanded and formed the Royal Ransomware Gang. So you have to keep in mind that these very experienced members of Conti pivoted over to the Royal Ransomware Group. Now, in September, I mean, they really were known for gaining their notoriety here by getting 43 new victims just in November of that year. I mean, to me, that's massive, right? Like I'm saying, they're very, very, very busy. Now, with this, in May of 23, they just simply rebranded. That's all it was. So they're still the Royal Ransomware Gang, but they decided, you know what, let's change our name because there was some implications and some fighting going on, and like it was legal implications as well. No, we'll just change our name to avoid all of this nonsense. And so now they're known as Blacksuit. That brings us to specifically Q2 of this year. As I said, they've been busy. They're attributed to 13 or roughly 13 ransomware incidents within this quarter alone. And they are suspected of being responsible for the largest disruption in the automotive dealer industry. Now, we're not going to name names of the companies of which they're associated with. However, I will say that, take it with a grain of salt, but I did read that the automotive thing that you may be familiar with that I'm talking about yielded $25 million in their ransom. So, each one of their requests usually starts with a $2.5 million ransom ask. It's pretty big. Now, who are their preferred targets? They go after healthcare. They go after educational organizations, so any schools. They go after critical industry sectors, such as police departments, fire departments, right? So they're kind of going after, historically, even ransomware groups would say, yeah, we're not going to touch that. That's their focus. They're like, no, we're going for it. And they are also attributed to a giant media conglomerate. So they're going after media as well. Now, in one of the examples, again, it's an unnamed target here. How did they do it? To get initial access, they just used a non-primary VPN using valid credentials. Again, there's a lot of different ways that we, as attackers, can get those credentials, one of them being dumps. But this was an unmonitored system, not updated, kind of ignored and just ancillary to the network almost as though it was put there and just forgotten about, right? So they got VPN access with these valid creds. And then once they got in, they started doing the post-access process of Kerber roasting. So they're dealing with Active Directory enumeration and hacking and passing the hash and doing those kinds of things. The interception, like I was saying, with Responder as well, and grabbing all of those credentials once they're inside the network. From there, they're using PSExec for that lateral movement as they're moving throughout the network and adding, more nodes within their list. And then, of course, internal brute forcing to further their access along, and then ransomware deployment in terms of,
Not sure if we just lost Anthony. Think we might have. All right. Yeah, we lost Anthony. Thank you. All right. He was just about wrapping up the TTP workflow there. Essentially getting into, post-access ransomware deployment. I mean, that's the ultimate goal, right? And from there, exfiltration, ransomware deployed through Windows VM for obfuscation, et cetera. But really, once you've got the ransomware deployed, I mean, the goal has been achieved at that point. So from a customer perspective, you can see that this call to action looks a little bit different than some of the previous recommendations, and that's because we're not dealing with a CVE here, right? We're dealing with a ransomware group. And so when that's the case, you're really going to be more so centered around your security controls, right? Looks like we got Anthony back. Don't worry, I picked it up for you.
all right,
So
cool.
yep, all good. So when we're talking about security controls, things like asset inventory, of course, having an appropriate EDR solution in place, log ingestion system like a SIEM, network monitoring, robust password policy, et cetera, et cetera. All the things I'm sure that many of you individuals are focused on within your organization, and those things are incredibly important when dealing with sophisticated threat actors. So from Lumifi's perspective, how do we approach something, as really, complicated and, technical as the Blacksuit Ransomware Gang? So at least from my perspective, I'm sure Anthony would agree, it's understanding the things that they usually do, right? What do they usually do and what are they typically looking for? And making sure that from a detection engineering perspective that we can evaluate our detection library and identify any gaps specifically that we may be missing that would, identify something that this type of group is looking to exploit. We absolutely reference like the MITRE ATT&CK framework to, ensure that we have appropriate coverage, from beginning to end. It's a ever-going, ever-changing battle. But when we get specific information like we received around Blacksuit, we'll ensure that our detections are correlated in that direction. All right, so kind of wrapping up here, getting towards the end, just wanted to share with everybody some of the detection engineering that Anthony and my team have been working on just in Q2 alone. I won't go over every single one of these, but just kind of wanted to display it. You can see things like MOVEit, you can see things like Redline, Lockbit 3.0, Oyster, some of these very specific named threat groups and vulnerabilities and types of malware variants, kind of try to cover all of it from every different angle. And this is an ongoing effort based on threat research and just consistently evaluating where we're at from a detection perspective and the gaps that we may have. All right, so before we dive into Q&A, we actually got a couple questions for everybody to see if you were paying attention along the way. So we should see that pop up on your screen now, and I'll let Anthony kind of take this over.
All right. So first question is, which cookie does the PANOS CVE-2024-3400 utilize for the command injection? Was that SysID, user agent, authorization, or PHP SysID? The second question here is, which of the following groups is unrelated to the Blacksuit ransomware group? Would that be the Royal ransomware group, the Conti ransomware group, Revil, or Blacksuit ransomware group? So let's see what you guys come up with, you guys and gals here. And we'll give you a moment to get those in.
All right, Anthony, I think we can go over the correct answers.
All right. Now, for the first one, it is the SysID cookie. So it might be, if you've ever done account takeover through cookie sessions, you might have chosen the PHP SysID, but this is just the SysID. And then, of course, the number two answer can't be Blacksuit ransomware because that's who they are now, but it is Revil. Remember, they started as Conti, very prolific. They disbanded that, turned into the Royal ransomware group, and it's a simple branding, rebranding movement to become Blacksuit. So very, very skilled group, been doing it for a lot of years.
All right, thank you for that. And we'll take a minute or two here. I know we're kind of past time. Why don't we give it to 11:35 for any Q&A? If you guys have any questions, we're happy to take them. Unless, of course, there are no questions.
We addressed it all.
We got everything, I guess. All right, I think we will wrap it up. Thank you again, everybody, for your time. Have a great rest of your week, and we will see you next time for Q3. Thank you.
All right, thank you, everybody.